everywhere else I go doesn't have the kind of like angst that would be part of the thing here, you know? Also, everywhere else I go is much more segregated than here. So if I go see the music community in Dallas, where my family's from, or go for like Texas, or go to California, it's not diverse like here, and it's not edgy like here. Maybe it just hasn't made it there yet, but it's something going on here. Maybe some achievement and integration that somehow worked better than other places. I don't know what, but there seems to be more of a like agency about the young people expressing themselves and making it their own thing in a way that everywhere else seems to be like really controlled by like, you know, out of touch 30-year-olds who like, you know, think that alt country is cool or something. It's not so NPR here as everywhere else. My name is Todd Patrick, and I, he's making a piece here about the spaces I operate, which are this place, Transpicos, and the other place, Market Hotel, but specifically the Market Hotel.
How long have you been operating this?
I've been involved in that space since 2008. The little place we have is, rough around the edges and, ways that are, I hope, and I think are glaringly not intentional. I think people are so used to that being insincere, or that concept of like a scruffy, heart in the right place little spot trying to like make it work, that they're so used to that being a marketing angle that comes out of some like, multifaceted marketing strategy for a rollout of something that has a public relations company working for it. We're not that at all, and I think you can really tell. Everywhere else that seems to open seems to be the representation of the kind of like startup cash and ongoing like payroll. You must have a fucking army working for these places to exist. Nobody does places like this anymore. No one opens businesses that with their heart in the right place where they don't go get a pile of investors or a massive bank loan or some other funding source and put together a slick as shit, completely realized concept, whether it's a restaurant or a bar or anything. Everything people open these days is that. I didn't want to be tied up in all that shit and didn't want to be beholden, for better or for worse. And like, I think there's a reality about that that makes the place unique to people in a way they either perceive subconsciously or consciously, and it has that appeal. Not to everybody. Lots of people don't like it, but there are people that to which it's something that's unique, and it's different, and there's just not anything like that anymore. But it is, there is a relevancy and importance to places like this existing, whether or not we achieve that or not, but places like this that have existed in the past that became important to defining not only an era in like some popular culture idea, but people's individual lives. That you talk to people who went through CBGBs or went through, the Paradise Garage. It's not just about some like societal movement era bullshit that people make documentaries about. These are people's personal lives that are enriched in a way that they change the course of what they're doing for part of their life when they're young. And this experience happens where they go to this place or they are part of this community that really changes things. And they become a person they wouldn't otherwise have become. And that, I think, is, it's life or death to some people, not to sound really dramatic or whatever, but it is. And why we do this shit, why these places exist, is supposed to be for that purpose, to like change what the, texture and atmosphere and availabilities and possibilities in our world is, and not just to be the same cookie cutter bullshit. And that's become very cliche, say all that kind of stuff. It's become very like, touchy-feely, I suppose. But the truth is that it's still true, and more importantly, I think society is suffering because it hasn't been prioritized, and it's been seen as like, so bullshit. It's not, it's not, and no, the internet is not replacing this experience, That said, from a purely like personal and financial and like sanity standpoint, as an individual myself, as the person who, has to sort of, will this thing into existence all the time, despite a lot of other people being involved in helping and contributing, it's very hard to justify at a certain point the self-sacrifice involved, which, especially for myself, I have a family, I've got like other responsibilities in my life, it changes my possibilities in life, what I can do, the amount of, I can't leave town for 2 months. I can't do anything. I'm married to these things. And it's not just on those kind of simple levels. It's also like, there is an assumption of debt and risk that quite literally no peer of mine does, that I have had to do to make these places exist. And that's, sincere. And that's not just some pour out my soul. This is why this is, you appreciate these places. Oh, they're a dying breed. It's not like that. It's like I'm literally doing stuff to keep these places alive on a personal sacrifice level that is frankly inadvisable, and it's part of the thing that makes this so thankless in a way, not to sound like a martyr, but is that there was a sense back in the, talk about CBGBs, Studio 54 or whatever. You're talking about places that their place in history, their place in relevancy, their place in it being worth the people involved making these kind of sacrifices to make them exist, was clear by their very quick, not necessarily quick, but their very thorough embrace by the cooler elements of the establishment, going to them. You get famous movie stars, whatever. I feel very firmly that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore unless you're doing stuff that's pretty mainstream. I think that the fact is you could have trusted celebrities, famous people, movie stars, people from a earlier generation who had achieved success, who were heroes, coming out and supporting places in cool, right-on, artistically valid music venues in, let's say, LA or New York, back for decades, as long as I was alive. These days, not true, and it's been that case for a long time. They might get movie stars at, they got movie stars at CBGBs, they got movie stars at Studio 54, they got movie stars at all those places. We've never gotten movie stars at Market Hotel, even during the time when we were unequivocally lauded as being an important space, which was probably 2008, 2009, 2010. Its first era when it was the dead center, the DIY indie rock thing that I was associated with. And even then, they weren't coming to Bushwick. They weren't coming to these kinds of places. I don't know if it's because their handlers tell them it's not safe. God only knows. I think it's probably a statement about the kind of change in the demographical kind of income distribution situation in this country. Real wealth lives in a bubble these days, and it's also a matter of people have come to associate a place that's smart, a place that's got the ideas that are going to be relevant and in currency or important, a curatorial concept that comes to that, whether you're opening a restaurant or a bar or a museum. These are all somebody's vision doing it. I think it's become knee-jerk now for people to associate that with how slick it is, how put together it is, how much people's business skills are supposed to be seen as which is the ability to put an investor group together, is somehow seen as an indicator of intelligence, an indicator of taste, an indicator of being in the right way. These days, when I encounter people in the creative industries, creative music, whether it's making movies or whether it's putting records together or whether it's opening a bar or a restaurant, these things are, the ones who get the most capital are shamelessly and straightforwardly assumed to be the ones who are smarter and better. So I don't want to go work with a bunch of investors and a bunch of system where 9/10 of my work is about managing partners and dealing with paperwork and doing all this presentation and all this garbage that I don't want to put my energy into, And it used to be that there were lots of spaces to which that was the case, and you could appreciate a different facet of the place as being something that made it a valuable thing for society. And I feel like the story of Market Hotel, hopefully, at least from my very selfish and not, and very self-centered point of view, is the idea that this is the product of people who aren't fucking around with all that shit. That may be foolish, it may be inadvisable, it may be risky, but we're trying to follow the law, follow the rules, keep it as simple as possible, and not get weighed down with a bunch of other crap that I'm not going to be good at. Because it will only take away from the ability to, in my opinion, trumpet the stuff that's the most worthy of being trumpeted in terms of the cultural output of my community. It's a difficult game, however, because for all that dedication, the mere fact of not participation in that structure of how everyone else defines success or transmits intelligence or transmits cultural knowledge in a way that people want to get behind and endorse, there's quite a lot of intelligent, bright people who have sort of taken on to that kind of point of view. So we can't necessarily get the bookings. Back in the 70s, the 80s, even the 60s, there would have been a right-on attitude. People would have wanted to go there and do their space. And we get some of that, but we don't get as much as the same concept got 12, 13, 15 years ago, or punk got in the 80s, because I feel like the society has moved towards a premium placed on an ability to manage all of the levers of financial success before one is given entrusted with any authority in terms of culture anymore. I mean, you work in the film industry where that's absolutely been the currency forever. The ability to get your shit funded makes more difference than fucking anything. Well, it's the same in music now. And that's, to me, shitty. Because in my experience, the people who can get the funding often have the worst fucking ideas. And when I think of the Chinese model and the Russian model and all the models of these like neo-hyper-capitalist states, their vibe is to go as far down this road that our country is now falling into as possible. That money, basically might makes right, except it's money instead of guns. And that's the belief everyone seems to have. And it's just like, there was a time when this kind of like nakedly idiotic libertarianism, I mean libertarian culturally rather than in terms of like the idea of, if you made the money, then you did the right thing, right? Just getting performers to come and perform is a struggle. And it's only changed in the last several years because the place has become associated with a certain ethos that is finally, and this is what's exciting right now, finally back in some kind of currency. Maybe it's a cartoonish kind of like oversimplification of radicalism or of the progressive ideas and like trying to believe that there's such a thing as independent spaces. But there is a movement of these young people who, of course, it's part of the same generation of wokeness and whatever, but it's like, it's there, and there's a response, there's a sense of need for these kinds of places to exist, which had been, in my opinion, kind of vanishing from the earth. And I think in a more cultural trend worldwide, it's sort of a dying idea of like, this idea that why don't we let regular people build their own thing and control their own culture and have like, contribution. Everything doesn't have to come down from on high and be part of this corporatized setting. Now people think their creative culture is expressed through their TikTok account. It's like, anyway, I could babble forever. I'm not going to say like the kids, the musicians come in, the young people come in, and they've, they've been at a Black Lives Matter protest, and they come in and they have a lot of angst to get off their chest. I mean, this is not a fucking spoken word music venue, It's not that kind of like phony, pass through, like, come see the whatever. But there is certainly the music we work with tends to have more of an edge to it than some of the other places do in terms of angst and anger. I wouldn't say everything we do, that's the case at all. We do a lot of different stuff. But the stuff that I think we're getting, again, notice for doing is the stuff that has more angst in it, more anger. And certainly part of the kind of marginal community we work within creatively, part and parcel of that is a sort of like, a facade of very cynical kind of sense of, you don't weigh in on what was in the newspaper because it's probably not the truth. There's certainly a wide feeling of that. There is, I think, amongst, maybe by virtue of the fact that we have more marginalized people involved in being the people who see the shows and the people who play the shows, perform them, there's more angst there and for, but also the fact that it's something of a self-selecting group of every one of those demographics, that these are people who are smart. They know what's up, and it would be second nature to say that the smarter you are, the angrier you ought to be right now. Certainly if you're young. Older people, that same process of sort of internalizing the righteousness of the existing system seems to happen when people turn 40 and have children. But I do think that there is among the young people more of an opening, a feeling of like, yo, I'm smart enough to pay some attention here, and this is all, I'm just not even mad about. Whether that's devoted at one particular current event or not, or one particular popular movement of politics or news, well, no, it's not, again, not so on the nose, but there is certainly anger there, Maybe we live in a time where there's just a lot to be angry about. Yeah, the whole world lives in that world, yeah. And I think we're attracting a self-selecting crew of smarter kids, My feeling anyway. In my opinion, more intelligent. Of course, that's the most fucking subjective thing that ever stated. But elitist too. But the point is, I think smart kids, smart people, they feel something's wrong, and they're looking for that IRL experience of like being around a bunch of other people who feel the same way they feel, even if it's never stated any kind of overt way, even if that's not like the conversations that are happening in the bathroom. There's a reason these kids are coming to this place. I sometimes feel like people feel like if they don't make money, they won't get on the escape ship to get off the planet or something. When I don't even mean that figuratively, I think people have internalized that we're literally living in the apocalypse and that they need to hoard fucking money in order to fucking not be part of the crew that goes down with the volcano. It's like, I think that might be true. It used to be like the idea that sometimes the art was better even if the business wasn't so good. And I feel like that has changed because there's a real perception these days of like, if you're not making money, then you're a fool, And having lived in New York for 20 years or whatever, 22 years, it's there's a certain New York variety that's been the case among like the cognoscenti here forever. It's like, if you're smart, you got in on real estate in the 80s, If you're smart, I came up with the Williamsburg people. They're like, if you're smart, you converted lofts in the 90s. If you were smart, the smart people staked their claim, made an investment, did this and that. And I'm not saying that I'm immune to this. I don't think there's anything really wrong with such a concept. It's just the idea that like that being has somehow supplanted being, following your dreams in life with this sense that the only thing that's valuable as a person, especially as a, adult, mature, middle-aged human being like I am, that you have to be following that kind of a model, or else what you're doing is bullshit. It's funny though, because the kids feel the exact fucking opposite and are way, way, way more dogmatic, even more so, in what I consider to be fairly insincere and like intellectually inconsistent, like hate of anything that's capitalistic or calling everyone a gentrifier all the time and everything, like that. It's funny. I grew up in among a bunch of people. The crew that I came up with, my generation came up believing that it was really cool if you owned a restaurant that was like great, making great food, whatever. And now it's a time when like that's seen as hopelessly bourgeois and like possibly abusing and selfish and anti-civil, like part of the occupier culture we live within, it's all like so ridiculous. There's both these are, I'm going to go on a limb here and say both these concepts are fucking wrong, like, well, it's non-profits is a whole different energy, but like the whole energy of like all capitalism, we should live our lives and judge everyone around us as if we live in a post-capitalist society, which is a really common fucking attitude with people under 30. And then on the other side, you got people over 40 who just, essentially think that you either choose an extremely stable lifestyle that is risk-free, or if you're doing anything thoughtful or smart, you better do it with like all the investment you could possibly get, to the point that you're like a tiny sweat equity partner in your own dream, which seems to be the way that a lot of other people operate their lives. It just seemed to me that there was a time when like doing something that was, fulfilling, in like a capital R romantic kind of way, was a valid lifestyle for an adult. We live in a very conservative society, even though people believe we live in a very like, historically liberal. It's actually the opposite. Things are much more battened down than they were when I was a kid. You know, it may be easier for certain marginalized groups, and that's wonderful, and that's great progress. But in all this other cultural shit, it's much more narrow-minded in terms of what is acceptable behavior. A lot more like, you know, just a lot more of dismissalness of like people's, you know, it's just, we live in a society where, you know, a lot of people are deemed losers. Like, it makes it very hard because people are very conflicted about how to value anything they see anymore. So that the young people, it's like, you know, like you're always downplaying the fact that that it lives in any kind of financial reality, you know. And with the older folks, it's all like, you know, either you have to pour on the guts that this is a passion project, or you have to constantly say, you know, this is a not-for-profit, or we're doing this for this like haughty cultural purpose. You know, it's like, honestly, when I talk, it's like this isn't what it's doing on its own terms is a haughty cultural purpose. The last 50 years, it's in New York City's external culture. There's two big things that came out of New York musically. Three, really. One, or four, I guess. There's fucking punk rock, CBGBs. There's hip hop. There is the kind of house music, queer house universe that came out of like the Paradise Garage in the 80s. And then more recently, it's reggaeton, which people think is from Puerto Rico, but it's from New York. And these are the cultural outputs. Not one of these things gets grants for shit. You know? Not one of these things has any kind of relevance on a high cultural level. But I feel that to make my shit make sense to people who are my own peers, my own age, I've got to portray it as if I'm doing fine art. Because if it's not fine art, it's horseshit. Even though nothing fine art-wise, particularly not in music, has been that fucking important in the last several years. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, you can go listen to some avant-garde stuff, but most of it's pretty square at this point, and pretty boring, and pretty fucking like chasing the goddamn grant and not chasing the like artistic vision. And that's honestly way more cynical than this ostensibly capitalist nightlife community that I'm part of. The only conversations people have are like trying to find a way to work within the machine or pretend they're going to take it down, neither of which is real. You know, like, that's just, I don't know. It strikes me as moving towards the kind of hopelessly dysfunctional state apparatus that you find in like China. Because it's really a cultural apparatus of like, why would you ever challenge this? Of course we all know that they're picking our pockets. Of course we all know that the moment there's a recession in China, they're going to nationalize all the bank accounts and everyone's going to lose all their money. Of course we know that these people are corrupt. Of course we know that they, you know, that they're murderous if they have to be. But why would you ever change it? That's just stupid to try. And that seems to be the prevailing attitude in this country, which is exactly what makes a regime like China's or Russia's or lots of other places exist. Is that sense. I've been in a lot of Latin America where they had years and years of like baby versions of these kinds of governments. And the culture there is very dismissive of anybody bucking the system whatsoever. One of the reasons that we're able to kind of have some kind of relevancy here that wouldn't exist if I was doing this in, you know, Houston, is that here we actually have young people from different backgrounds, not just white college, but middle-class college kids, who come out, who, you know, again, self-selecting crew from even those scenes, but like, that's, I think, part of it. Like, they're actually a legitimate part of the scene and not just tokenism, you know? Not just, you know, like, the kids who are the most assimilated. You know, these are kids who are just who they are. But it's funny, these cultural spaces, especially when you get in a marginalized cultural space, not like going to see a show at Madison Square Garden, but like going to see a show at some bar, going to see a show at some like little tiny place. There's segregation on display in those kinds of gatherings of crowd that go far beyond any bar, any like non-cultural bar you've ever gone to, you know? It's kind of nuts. And I never thought about this until more recently in my life because I was doing this forever. I was promoting parties. But dude, I was promoting parties for white people, you know? It's like, and I never thought about it. It's just like, oh, this is just what we do. There's parties for other people too. There's just, I mean, anyone can come. They just don't like it. Yeah, you know, it's just now I realize the degree to which that was not. It led to a blandness that has only gotten worse in more recent years. 90% of all not-for-profits are jobs programs for their executive staff. And that's important to know about it because people think that not-for-profits guarantee some kind of like, you know, some kind of like being idealistic or being altruistic. None of that is true. There's nothing more altruistic. Not-for-profits mostly exist for their own budgets. Not to say they all do, but there's not paying taxes, which is all not-for-profit is, does not guarantee a place is ideologically or like ethically in the right. And that bears saying because people, especially people my own age, they tend to think that that's the marker of sane martyrdom when it comes to trying to help the world, working within the not-for-profit charity system. I'm sorry, I don't see the results. Call me nuts, but I find, especially in the cultural side of things, I don't think they're pushing the good culture. I don't think they're pushing the shit that fucking matters, and I certainly don't think they're pushing the stuff that speaks to me. When we talk about public support for the arts, we're talking about rich people. Rich people and powerful people, nepotistic people.
Exactly.
This came into focus for me doing stuff in Mexico, and not just doing stuff in Mexico, but also doing stuff at South by Southwest. So I used to every year do a thing at South by Southwest. Every year I'd take a bunch of young volunteers, interns, whatever word you want to use, down to help with this thing we do at South by, where we get all these people who are at that festival to come and play something for us as a non-revenue kind of like cool event. And we use this dive bar, and we just did it there. And it got to be pretty popular. They made a documentary about that. But anyway, point being, one of the things we got the most of were the people who had been flown to Austin by their governments. So it's like bands from Sweden, bands from New Zealand, bands from Japan, bands from whatever. Because if you're a cultural affairs department of a fucking consulate or an embassy, you've got a bunch of cash, and you're like, how are we going to, my job that my country's government gave me is supposed to promote the arts in my country. Are you going to go and promote little shows here and there in every town in America? Fuck no. You're going to take the opportunity to put them in front of a bunch of what the media has decided is a influential event, and you're going to put on a showcase at South by Southwest, because then you can use the government's money to buy a bunch of beer. You can use the government's money to pay for a nice hotel in Austin. You can use the government's money to take some people out to dinner. All the things that if you work in the consulate, these are good things to do. So they all do the same shit, and they all bring these piles of bands over from New Zealand, and the piles of bands over from Sweden, and piles of bands over from wherever, and they bring them over. But of course, these people work in the fucking consulate. They don't know anything about the scene. What do? They look to see who is the recipient of government funding. So all these bands the government of New Zealand has invested in. And you'd think that in New Zealand for its size of a country, it's Canada to Australia's USA. But both those countries are a third the size of their other parts. I mean, New Zealand's real small, but has a really great music scene for being so small. So there's lots of talent there. And, to their credit, everybody doesn't know each other. It is very small. But I would do these things, and the people who would perform, sometimes very talented, sometimes not, would be literally the children of the most famous people from the fucking country. Because that's who gets the fucking grant. And it's no different anywhere else. The Dutch government pays for this shit, or the French government. It's like the bigger countries generally don't know. Britain doesn't do it. France and Germany, they don't really do this shit. But you talk about Belgium, you talk about the little EU countries, and obviously some Asian countries that are trying to sort of have a European cultural model, standard of living. Japan, Korea, Singapore. These are places that they do this sometimes. And then New Zealand and Australia definitely do it too. They pay for these events. So I got to see who was the recipient of this kind of public quote unquote funding. There's nothing public about it, and it certainly wasn't the cream rising to the top generally. There's some exceptions, but generally speaking, not. And that's where I started to question this whole idea of the way out of our cultural problems in this country, the way out of our the dominance of corporate culture is to make everything not for profit, or have the government fund all the arts and this and that. Especially living in New York, where you see who's the recipient of some of these grants. It's unfortunate that the backlash against modern art and whatever in the 80s created this whole attitude of only morons oppose government funding the arts. I don't oppose government for the arts. I just question the supremacy of government funding for the arts. Not to say the capitalist system's any good, but neither one's great. They're both fucked up. And so my point would be that like most of the stuff I've cared about that's come out of the American system in the last, 30 years has not come out of things that were funded by not-for-profit funding or public funding. They came out of things where were fucking asses in seats paid for it. Does that mean that might means right and the more people go into something makes it more valuable? No. But it does mean that supporting that emerging level of aspiring shit at the bottom doesn't seem to be something that the public funding system does very well. And so that being the case, you can pour all the money you want into people who've emerged who've blossomed and need to be pushed, but that doesn't generate the next generation of them. It doesn't work that way. So if you have like the most savvy, the most thoughtful, the most tasteful people in the world scouring the country looking for who deserves to be funded for their project, this and that, in some kind of supposedly equitable way, you're still not going to generate the stuff at the bottom in the way that the current system does. And that doesn't mean that the current system doesn't generate more garbage than good. It does. But I don't see the stuff that speaks to me happening at all outside of the like terrible fucking system that we have in this country for arts funding, which is entirely popular based. And that's a sad thing to say as somebody who would like to believe there was a better way, but I haven't seen one. And so that being said, I won't want to be a fucking not-for-profit. And part of the reason we had to stop being not-for-profits, because both the place you're in and the other space that the documentary is ostensibly about, both were underground spaces. And let me tell you something, underground spaces are fucking capitalist, but people believe that's not the case. They're all selling drinks on a card table. That's money, buddy. They're still taking money at the door, Just because a place isn't legal doesn't make it's like, like anti-capitalist. It's like, what I mean? It's funny that people have this, especially younger people have this like connection, but whatever. That's a smaller problem. So these spaces were these underground punk spaces that both got shut down pretty dramatically by the police. And they were both beloved spaces, at least among the community I surrounded myself with. And so people, there was some popular support for the idea of let's legalize these spaces. And at first I thought, I'll become a not-for-profit and we'll make these institutions. These will be like, it's as if CBGBs have become a not-for-profit and survive forever. And that's what I thought I was going to do. And so I got these not-for-profits and I went to all this trouble. I was like, this is going to be something I set up and it'll be for future generations, and someday I'll pass the baton to some other executive director and I'll have my picture on the wall and that'll be all my involvement is, but it'll continue to live and I'll be happy. And I tried to do that. And then I realized a couple of things. First of all, there ain't no funding in the world for this shit. Nobody's giving grants to things that look like this or act like this, no matter how clean and nice we make it. They will not fund it because you Google it, and it's a bunch of white guys with their shirts off, like doing this, or whatever. Or even young people. They don't give a shit. It's just people. It doesn't look like fine arts. You can't get funded. And the second side of it is that the fact that you cannot operate a music venue that in any way dabbles in like legitimate art without selling alcohol. Not only because that's where the money, how the economy works in it, but it's also because people don't want to go. Nobody wants to go see a band at a dry club. But the fact is, alcohol is not only the funding model, it's also a prerequisite to getting people to come to the show. People don't want to go out if they can't imbibe. And that's just truth. So, you have to have the booze. It doesn't make you like a scumbag who's trying to steal money from people. You got to sell the booze because people don't want to come if there isn't any booze. And the band doesn't want to play if there's not any booze. It's all, it's not a system that works. You're not going to change that system. So anyway, we have to have liquor licenses, right? And by the way, I might add, they have liquor licenses at the fucking Broadway. Took my daughter to see Frozen. We went to go see, The Music Man. They have bars, You go to a Yankee game. They have fucking drinks, and it's all ages, I should add. And people they have restaurants, They have alcohol at the opera. When we started to become targeted by a police officer, we were targeted by a cop whose stated goal, and they told me this straightforwardly, was the fact that we were attracting people who might get mugged. And because we attract people who might get mugged, and they might be carrying a MacBook Pro or something else that's over $1,000, which makes it grand larceny and not just petty theft, that these are people, and they're also people who, I should add, might have homeowners insurance, or renter's insurance, or their parents who bought the MacBook Pro might, that they then have to generate when those people get mugged, they have to generate a police report. And so the report of the crime does not magically flitter away and disappear. So it makes the stats look bad for these police officers because they care about the stats. Because the stats are how there's a program called CompStat where they're all judged by their stats versus the same stats a year previous, and that's how they get promoted. Because grand larceny is one of the ones, the big five or whatever it is, that show up on CompStat. It's grand larceny, it's assault, sexual assault, obviously rape, murder. These are the ones that like show up on CompStat. The major things that when they devised the system in the 90s that it was meant to like address. So that literally that we got hounded by cops for years. We eventually got our license despite them, and then they found a way to get the license away. And in the process, we had made, because we were always doing a lot of social work in this space, for years and years and years, because we were not-for-profit, we were not only having the concerts, which we felt were very culturally important, we were also during the day doing a lot of community programming. So we had all of these groups using the space. We had there was a family homeless shelter in East New York that would use the space for some events. We did daily, or almost daily, it was like 3 times a week, music therapy sessions for these people from this group called Rainbow Adult Living, which is like not Rainbow Adult Living, AHRC, which is the largest state-funded, not-for-profit working for developmentally disabled people. So like severely autistic and severely mentally retarded adults. And so we would do these, groups in here. We'd also do things with some of the local schools and also with like a lot of the daycare centers. We'd have all these like sort of cultural enrichment outreach stuff. We were doing community work of that sort, 4 or 5 times a week. And in doing so, we'd made a lot of friends, a lot of people in politics. Not as we would find out, very useful friendships, but friendships. And we thought this was the appropriate thing about the idea of why not be a charity, a legitimate charity in the model of what is supposed to be appropriate for a man who's at the time 40 years old and has kids. Like do the space that's great, there's good work, and it has a cultural end, and it's just a wholesome place that's also not lame. Because that's the thing, that being wholesome yet not lame is a pretty hard line to walk, Anywho, so we tried to do that. Well, what happened with the not-for-profit shit, to make my story very short, is that once this cop got his little fingers on how he thought he could finally fuck us after we got our license anyway, is that he and his buddy at the State Liquor Authority started calling the elected officials we had befriended. And he did this right as we were trying to fight his harassment. And he basically said to them straightforward, and some of them said this to us, they're like, if you're a not-for-profit, why do you sell alcohol? And I hear that you let kids in there? So, whatever. But so we lost all of our political support right at the time the guy hit us the hardest with his selective enforcement shit. And we got hit really fucking hard. I don't want to get into all the details of it, but they managed to basically create conditions where we had no choice but to fold. So we had to close the place down, or we got rid of our liquor license, but we kept existing. And at the same time we got rid of our liquor license here, they kept Market Hotel from being able to get a liquor license. And I had to formally step down from that aspect of running the business. I had to hand that aspect of running the business off to other people because that had been so misconstrued and misrepresented at the State Liquor Authority and at other law enforcement that it became untenable for me to be involved in that kind of business, which is all well and good for me because I don't want to be involved in that kind of business. So that stuff still happens, but it's done through a separated thing. So my focus is on the curatorial and on the more like broad stroke way of we operate the place and trying to be a place that is doing stuff that's culturally and artistically relevant. And I don't mean that in a way that's like going to get a grant. I mean that in the way of like, this is what will be, coffee table books get written about. In a few years, I hope, if not to sound so fucking self-important, And to some degree, what you choose affects what comes to you next. And that's the name of the game. So no. Do the bands here represent this whole amorphous concept I'm coming up with? Not consciously nor consistently. But I like to believe that in the end, the thrust of things and the scenes that we create a petri dish for, not to sound like a total cliche of cultural growth, but it's true that you're an incubator for this stuff, that by creating this incubator, you're actually creating the next scene that may, if you're lucky, grow in your spot. It used to be that the live shows were an outgrowth of, the recordings were an outgrowth of an attempt to record the live show. You know, Beatles obviously famously are the changing point of that. But even in the Beatles, it was still a matter of, man, I wish I could see them live, you know? These days, a lot of these artists, their live thing is not where they came up. They came up through track trading on, you know, recorded tracks they've made in their own home. So, therefore, their requirements for sound are very high, because what you can make sound on little headphones in your head, or on speakers this big in your room that's the size of this closet, when you want to represent such a sound with recorded beats and, you know, all kinds of electronic instruments and all this other shit, you need a sound system that is like capable of a great degree of bass and a great degree of range and like accuracy in its reproduction that is well beyond what was ever expected of anything in terms of like, you know, the heyday of rock and roll. So that is a big thing. And it's also a huge barrier to entry, not just for clubs to be, or promoters to present this level of production, but it's a barrier of entry to artists. The fact is these artists are coming through and they're essentially kind of one-hit wonders these days because of the way that everything is very, you know, it's about tracks that become viral. And by virality, by nature, has a lot in common with one-hit wonders kind of energy. The artists come through, they're not veterans of this industry. They're easily taken in. And they're easily duped by managers and agents who are manipulating them. And so those managers and agents don't want to work at a place like Market Hotel. They wanted to go to the place where it's, you know, the highest level of professionalism and, you know, the highest level of like production, the highest level of everything else. Or just the most transactional level of themselves feeling elite, which is a lot of the reason why people get into such a field. People don't always manage bands and shit because they expect to make money. They just want to be cool, you know? They want to have cool, they want to be power, they want to feel like whatever. Everyone wants to be Colonel Tom Parker. But that's the thing, and every little band in the world has an agent and a manager these days. It didn't used to be that way either. So anyway, point being, these bands are young, they're naive, they're impressionable. It's very easy for that manager, that agent, to go to that band who's coming through New York City for the first time, who is from Pasadena or something, and just made beats on their computer until 2 years ago. It's very easy to be like, you don't want to take a chance with that place. You sure you want to do, I mean, you know, I know it's cool, but things could go wrong, and then you'll be on the internet tomorrow. Whisper that in a couple people's ears, guess what? They don't book a show at Market Hotel. So we face that. I say this long narrative, because we face that struggle too. To get artists to come to our room is hard, even if they love it. Even if they you know, have watched it from afar on the internet. Even if they believe in it. It's not, that used to be enough to get people to come in the door. These days, even if our production is as good as everywhere else, and I like to say it actually is reliably as good as everywhere else most of the time, it doesn't fucking matter, because the fear of fucking up in New York City, because New York's a big important play on your tour, is so great that they can talk them out of it. So we face this kind of a struggle. These places are so fucking hard to make in our own image curatorially. So you pretty much have to pick scenes that are not getting their due and believe in them and watch them grow in your little sandbox. Because it isn't going to happen that the people who are your intellectual and curatorial and, you know, artistic allies, ideological allies, are going to necessarily come to your space. And it's just, we live in a society now where the people that are in charge of everything have the dumbest fucking sense of reality and like, you know, and like scale or what's important or anything. And it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse than everywhere. That's why it's so shocking to see the ascendance of the Chinese model, the ascendance of the Russian model, because that's where they started out, you know? Is this sense of like absolutely, you know, impenetrably like tight, you know, power structure to which you cannot break in, controlling everything and calling all shots. And I feel like we're moving towards such the same thing. And all these little baby steps are towards there. So that's why, because we're important, in my opinion, to keep a place like this going. But it's very difficult because, again, you can't just pick bands that match what you're into or care about or whatever. You have to believe in things. And honestly, it's better in a way this way because then it grows organically. I'm not calling every shot on what happens in the room at all. nor is anybody, the booking agent or the house booker, anybody. We're all have intentions, and we have, we use our gatekeeping powers to let things through the door that we want, and the hope is that it will be something, and then the things happen. And sometimes they are duds we didn't expect them to be, and sometimes they're crazy, like amazing events when we expect them to be nothing. And that's the nature of it. But it's all like, it's not paint by numbers. Again, it's definitely like watercolors and like impressionism, and it's going to be what it's going to turn out to be,